数了多少，奶素、奶蛋素。
Hello， 各位线上的观众朋友们，大家好，我是今天 AND 讲座的主持人陈品一。那 AND 是一个科技与艺术跨域实验创作、媒合与推广的平台。那今年的主题是非日常。那我们依照这个主题呢，策划了一系列的工作坊啊、讲座，还有征件活动。那今天是讲座的第3场。那我们先前呢已经有分享过，像是用 AI 人工智慧去发掘人类未知的这个美味食谱。那我们今天要谈的主题呢是人类跟科技之间的一种既依赖但是又非常焦虑的一个紧密的状态。那我们今天邀请到的是国际非政府组织 Tactical Tech战略技术的就是总监 Stephanie Hankey 来跟我们分享这个主题哦。那我们首先先欢迎 Stephanie. Stephanie, can you say hi to us?
Yeah, hi. Nice to meet you all today.
Okay, thank you. 好，那我们今天的这个主题呢是希望科技应对疫情的100种方法哦。那它就是主要是要谈论从去年开始这个疫情的爆发到现在的后疫情的这样的一个状态，那有很多的科技产品被用来就是去解决疫情相关的这样的一个问题。那所以战略技术呢，他们就是从中选出了大概100种左右的这样的产品，那去了解说他们的设计的概念是什么，以及他们被用来解决怎么样的一个问题。然后最后还有一个最重要的是，就是在这些科技那个物品背后是被投入了人类怎么样的一个期望在其中。那这就是我们今天的这个讲座的一个主题哦。那接下来我们就会先播放这个已经预录好的讲座影片，那也上好的中文字幕。那结束之后呢，我们今天留了比较长的这个时间，可以让大家做 Q&A， 然后还有跟 Stephanie 直接的讨论。那所以因为战略技术他们是一个长期在针对科技批判还有数位素养上面的钻研的这样的一个组织。那所以如果有像是有想要数位排毒啦，或者是说对于网络上的个资问题感到安全性不知道有疑问，或者是说对于网络上面的这些假新闻要怎么样去破解他们种种这些范畴的问题都可以提出来讨论哦。那就是如果想要跟 Stephanie 有直接互动的话，可以加入我们现在这个 Zoom 的会议室，或者是说在脸书的连结下面留言也是可以的。好，那我们现在就开始进入今天的主题，希望科技应对疫情的100种方法。
Hi, I'm Stephanie Hankey, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, 45 minutes, about some of the work we're doing at Tactical Tech, and specifically I'm going to talk about a project called Technologies of Hope, which is looking at the way in which technologies have been used around the world in response to the pandemic. And then I look forward to questions and discussion at the end. So first, just to say a little bit about Tactical Tech. We're an international organization based mostly in Berlin, but we work all over the world. And we've been working since 2003 on thinking and looking in depth at how technology impacts society, how it politically and culturally and socially shapes the way we live. And we've been doing that in different ways. And I'm going to just start by introducing you to one of our projects, so you get some context on how we work and why we're doing what we're doing as well. A few years ago, around about 2015, we were very interested in broader questions around how technology impacts not only the way we live, but the way we imagine we want to live. And so we, like with different inspirations, looked at ways that we could start to engage people in what we think of as critical thinking and digital literacy. So ways that we could provoke discussion, ways that we could help people understand the questions that they need to navigate, not necessarily always giving answers, sometimes just provoking discussion. And so we started with a couple of inspirations. This is one of them, and we were really interested in the way in which technology is often presented as a kind of ideal. And this is an advert, for example, from the 1980s from CompuServe, talking about a future and looking visually as well, presenting a future which is kind of perfect. And this idea that we can be in our perfect homes together there, thinking about communicating with and working with and doing things with people on the other side of the world. And it sort of presents this perfect vision, also very white vision, very clean vision. And that's one of the inspirations we started with. You may already start thinking about companies like Apple and so on, you know, Samsung, these kind of aesthetics carry forward into the technologies we have now. And the second thing we were kind of interested in is this kind of cult around technology. So how is it that the technologies that we value and that we seek out, here's an image, for example, of that you might recognize this kind of thing happening. Here's somebody in particular emerging from the Apple flagship store in New York City, but of course this goes on around the world, with the first iPhone, and you know, you can see the people standing around her, kind of looks like she's just won a marathon, and there's this sort of aspirational quality to the technology, something that we see in a very positive light, and largely it is, and of course there are many exciting things about it, many ways that it changes, has changed our lives and the way we live. But one of the things we're interested in is how can you kind of rethink those narratives? So if we're predominantly, often by companies, but also culturally thinking of technology as a kind of, as a savior, as an amazing opportunity, as something that we can really build off and make our lives better. But how do we not go the other way? We don't have to make it dark. We shouldn't be necessarily thinking of this dystopic view of technology, but how can we complexify the discussion and how can we think more deeply about it? And so actually the original project started in 2016, and we started to play with this idea that ended up becoming the Glassroom. Here's a picture of what the Glassroom became in London. We wanted to create the same kind of atmosphere, the same kind of future vision, and the same kind of excitement, but we wanted to do it by flipping some of the narratives. And in the Glassroom, you go in, as you see here from the street, this is right in the centre of London, near Leicester Square in downtown London. You go in, you might think you're walking into kind of the latest Apple store or tech store with kind of new gadgets and so on. But then when you walk in, you find actually that nothing's for sale, and every piece in there, which might look like technology or other things, is a kind of an invitation for a critical discussion. And so this is what became the Glassroom. This is kind of how it is inside. Sometimes there are analog objects, sometimes there are digital objects. And this is just to give you an idea of the atmosphere that we've created in the Glassroom. These are really, these are pictures of it empty. They're very busy spaces. They're spaces with a lot of discussion and action. We have events, we run workshops. People can come with their friends, they can interact with things, they can talk, they can hang around there, they can come back. It's a free exhibition, often in these kind of shops that we take over on high streets. Here's the one in London again. And also people can try out technologies for themselves, and usually working with artists, sometimes with researchers and technologists. We're also trying to kind of open the box a little bit, kind of allow people to see inside, what are these technologies, how do they work? Here's, for example, an art piece called Megapixel by Adam Harvey, which allows visitors to kind of have a look, what does facial recognition look like? Here's somebody trying to find a match, but also, as with many things in the classroom, there's a deeper narrative looking at where do these images come from to begin with, what kinds of data collection is there off the internet for open images, and how can we start to really critically think about and understand how facial recognition technology really works. This example is from the Glassroom that we did in San Francisco in 2019. I should say actually that one of the things that we're interested in doing here, aside from engaging with the public, is that's why the exhibitions in San Francisco is also engaging with the makers of technology. So not just kind of and placing the glassrooms in central locations like in high streets and so on is also about getting all kinds of people to have this discussion. We're really interested not only in reaching the arts and culture community, or not only reaching a kind of tech community, but also anyone who's curious, anyone who uses technology. And this is one of the reasons why we have these events in these kinds of spaces. And the image you're looking at now is rather looking at and one of the more analog pieces we have there, which is a sort of 3D infographic, which allows you to look at all the companies that Google have acquired or invested in over the last decade or more. So sort of having a look a bit deeper inside the technology and how it works. This particular, there's another example here from a poster that we created, which is actually going a bit deeper into how the technology works. So sometimes we're trying to just kind of be playful, invite people to think about things. Other times we're trying to allow people to explore some of the details. And here we're trying to explain and unpack the technology. And in this one, we're sort of provoking and inviting people to think about the way in which technology is designed, thinking about the dark patterns or the kind of nudges that are actually built into technologies to try to make them quite addictive. In this case, sort of we're breaking out all the different things that are happening, for example, within a smartphone, and then asking the question, should we be blaming kids for being addicted to their phones, or should the technology companies be responsible or more responsible? So yeah, sometimes we're kind of touching the surface and allowing people to explore it. Other times we're trying to deconstruct the technology a bit so it's more understandable. So here's some examples here of how that works. And I should say you can see these all online, which we could give you information on towards the end of the talk or in the conversation. So the glass rooms that we did in those big shops, where we sometimes had 20,000 people through in 3 weeks, are very popular exhibitions. We had so much demand for them, and we really wanted to take this conversation much broader that a few years ago, we created a pop-up version of the glass room. So this is something that's much more accessible, much easier to put on, and it's possible to adapt it to different contexts, different kinds of questions as well. Here's an example of how the glass room was adapted in a really nice way to actually a subway station, in this case in Helsinki. So again, trying to have this conversation with a much broader group of people than would maybe normally walk into a gallery or an exhibition space. And here just maybe commuting, for example, thinking about these issues while people are waiting for a train. Or here is more recently adapted the misinformation edition we did for the Microwave Festival in Hong Kong. So yeah, the glass room through this kind of, it's kind of an exhibition. We think of it as an intervention because very often it comes with talks or workshops. We have something called a data detox kit as well that allows people to kind of try different things for themselves. And for us, this is about creating as broad and diverse a conversation as possible. So as of right now, anyway, we have had over 230 events in 47 countries around the world, and we want to keep doing that. So we're going to be, carrying on with that the next year or two, and also starting to take these exhibitions out of the spaces we've been experimenting with, even into street exhibitions. So that's what's coming up next for us. So that's a context of some of the things we do, some of the ways we work, some of the reasons we're doing this work as well, to really get a conversation going. As I said earlier on, we don't really want to push neither a techno-utopic nor a techno-dystopic view. We're really interested in allowing people to explore the dilemmas that these technologies create, and not necessarily to always know the answers, to sometimes sit with the discomfort of the fact that technology is disruptive in many ways, as the cliche goes. So I want to spend the rest of the time talking about one specific project we're developing now that will go in the classroom, but will also be shown in different contexts. And that's looking at what we call technologies of hope. And in this, what we're really interested in is looking at how technologies are being used in the context of what we think of as long and short emergencies. So the way in which technology is being used to respond to some of these enormous planetary challenges, like mitigating climate change, the rise of natural disasters, or of course the pandemic. And in this, we're looking at how technology, mainly big data-driven technology, machine learning technology, AI technology, or so-called AI technology, artificial intelligence, how it's being used to think about responding to these really big challenges. And what we've done is we spent quite some time looking since the beginning of last year at the rise of different kinds of technologies and the sort of reimagining of technology, or the reapplication of technologies that already existed to solving issues around the pandemic. And we looked at that in different ways. We thought about the way in which there's a kind of faith in data, in early warning systems and feedback loops that have been designed or co-opted from existing systems. That could be, really large-scale things like looking at Google mobility reports, for example. So how, lots and lots of information from around the world, from billions of people on Google Maps might, for example, give an insight to a country about where its people are, who's moving where, and so on, through to thinking about how governments have tried to put in ways to remotely control, meaning to mitigate the pandemic through, for example, putting measures in place, through to like how, and this is where the project focuses a bit more on future, what kinds of technologies are being developed, marketed, sold, imagined, that could actually help us back to normal, back to work, into this kind of no-touch future as it's often sold. And in this project, we're really interested in the way in which technology is presented to us by companies, the way in which, not just the way it's sold, but the way it's imagined, and the way we depend on it, the way we put faith in it as well. So we looked at over 250 technologies from around the world, and from that we curated a selection of 100 of those. And instead of thinking about them in terms of the different kinds of technology they use, which is definitely there, and there's some interesting patterns in terms of what kinds of technologies are being depended upon. Again, I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion time if it's interesting. But we really want to think about what's happening here. So we wanted to look at what kinds of things are being promised, which you see on the left side there, these kind of key terms. Some of them might look unusual, kind of strange. Some of them intriguing, like cough audio or smart helmet or predictive cleaning, things that you might not necessarily know what that means at first, but you might be curious. And then we looked at them in 4 categories. So we thought about technologies which are predominantly about observing, technologies which are about sensing, as you can see from the top there, maybe mitigating and then modifying. And we'll go through each of those 4 themes in a second. And with those themes, I'll show examples of what we selected. But the way this works is you can actually explore on the left side there, either by looking at those different categories or by looking at individual key phrases, and you can see information about those products, those companies. You can find out more about them. You can watch their videos and so on. And it's a way to kind of aggregate. I guess it's kind of like a snapshot in time. This is not saying all these technologies will definitely be used. This is not saying that they're bad or good or anything. It's more, we think of it as a kind of very intentional archive of a moment in time where we're struggling with a pandemic, and we're really putting a lot of faith in technology to get us away from it into a safer future. Those are the themes that I mentioned, and looking at different kinds of data collection as well for different reasons. The bottom line there, you'll see, for example, looking at ambient, biometric mobility, behavioral intelligence is really about the kind of information that's being gathered. And you'll see that as we go through the examples. This will probably make more sense to you when we've had a look at it. And lastly, just to say before we dive in, this is really not about only top-down, huge sort of country-level data collection. It's also about individual promises. It's about the democratization in that sense of intelligence, whether that's positive or negative. But what it means is that the ways in which technology is promising everything from, global kind of overview of the situation with the pandemic and global coordination, right the way down to like individual monitoring, how you can monitor yourself, how you can monitor your family. And the technologies are actually not that different, and sometimes they're even interconnected, because as the heading says here, sometimes the human is a kind of sensor. So meaning that you may be focused as an individual on your own feedback loop, on your own data, on your own early warning system, on your own mitigation system, but it may also contribute to a bigger one. And we'll come back to those themes as we go along. And the main question we ended up with after going through all this research and looking in depth at all the technologies was how we were sort of going around the question of how effective are they, but we ended up with this question of how in our objectives to control the virus have we succeeded maybe in controlling the host? Have we actually succeeded in, finding ways to mitigate the pandemic and control it, or have we come up with a lot of ways to control the human? Again, maybe coming back to these themes at the end would be useful. So first of all, looking at observing, this is about looking for patterns, finding ways to do predictions, looking for anomalies in a big data set or in a crowd, for example. And I'm just going to each time through these themes go through 3 examples. So starting from the kind of zoomed out perspective, this is a project called Blue Dot, and they were kind of credited as being one of the first companies to actually model through data how the pandemic was going to spread outside of Wuhan and where to. And so it's looking at a kind of global perspective of information of how we can better understand the movement, in this case of disease, and using different data sources, and in this case, heavily relying not only on sort of medical reports and local social media and so on, but also on flight pattern data. So how does the way we move across the globe help us understand and observe what's happening? The second example is more of a kind of slightly closer range one. This is a group called NSO Group, which is an Israeli company that is here adapting its technology to allowing governments to see, for example, as the slide shows, for example, where is a crowded spot in the city, for example. And this is, has been controversial, where a number of companies which are known for their intelligence technologies, which are normally used, as you can see, for terrorists and criminals or supervision or ways of thinking about data that would normally be more linked to law enforcement, intelligence services, and so on. But how is that being recast and rethought in the context of government oversight in specific cities or with specific groups of people? And then again, so zooming back into the individual, if we keep drilling down, here is another example of what we think of as observing. This is a project called Sick Weather. And this is a bit like a kind of, the idea is it's a bit like a weather forecast, but for health and for disease. And it's mainly crowdsourced from social media. So listening into and monitoring, or digital listening as it's sometimes called, what people are talking about and where, and helping people get information, in this case, not only to your browser, your app, but maybe also your smart watch, about what to expect in terms of who's sick, where the sicknesses are moving, and so on. So this is the observing category. The second one is looking more at biometric intelligence, and looking here at the ways in which technology is used to monitor or verify or screen individual human. And very much talking about sort of the idea of artificial intelligence in this case, or in other cases, machine learning and big data. But the point is analysis from large amounts of data collected as a way to depend on technology, in this case for care or for health. And a lot of these technologies in this section are a lot about collecting biometric information. And in order to kind of bring this to life a little bit, I'm going to just allow them to speak for themselves and play you their promotional video.
The power of vision. It's how we experience the world around us. And vision is only the beginning. When we see with intelligence, we understand, we recognize, we learn. And as we learn, we're better able to care for those around us. Introducing Care AI, the world's first computer vision platform for healthcare. A platform built with behavioral AI and machine learning. A platform with the power not only to see, but to understand and engage. Recognize emotions and intentions. Identify problems before they happen. And watch over and protect the things that matter most. Care AI, extending intelligence to care.
So I think it's really interesting when you start to see there's a couple of things going on there. One is being able to sort of somehow show and represent the technologies themselves. So you see those kind of points on the face, or recognizing a nurse walking around a room. And these are ways in which we imagine and we're presented with technology as having vision. And sometimes that's actually how it looks on the screen if you're using one of those systems. And sometimes in the promotional videos, you can see that they're kind of constructing kind of make-believe world. They're trying to make visible something that isn't visible. And the second thing that's going on in that video is also the idea of artificial intelligence as being able to create this kind of oversight care. There's a lot of metaphors there in terms of the sort of, I'd say, more maternalistic part of technology, that we can depend on it and rely on it, that it's always going to be there, and that it's going to know everything and be able to do everything for us. Could also be the way you see a doctor or a hospital. It doesn't have to be necessarily, it could be constructing a positive message, but at the same time, it's kind of strange, right? We're used to individuals, people with faces, people you would know or identify, be able to talk to as providing that level of care. So it's kind of interesting for multiple reasons. And then some of the other technologies are, again, so going down to the sort of mid-range, that's kind of like looking at care facilities without walls, I think they call it. And this is looking at ways in which the voice, in this case, for maybe groups of people, for example, people who work together, the voice can be used as a way through a mobile phone to detect whether or not you have COVID. And so this is about using vocal biomarkers, as they're called. So ways in which you could, for example, phone in to work, for example, from 0 to 50, some of them work on your voice, some of them you have to cough, they all work in slightly different ways. But this one basically claiming to be able to detect whether or not you potentially are sick, and you could call in beforehand on your phone, and this would be an indicator. So it's also a way from the other side for an employer to monitor a workforce. And then down to the individual level, a lot of the fitness trackers or wearables like Ava, the fertility tracker, there are many, many others being tested now and adapted to see if it can actually not only monitor you to see if you're sick, but actually let you know a couple of days beforehand, even whether you're going to become sick and therefore potentially have COVID or can get tested. So these are some of the technologies. Again, like I said, some of these are existing technologies that have been kind of extended into a space that we would not have expected a year or two ago. Obviously, a fertility tracker was not doubly designed as a pandemic tracker. So these are kind of new adventures that we're going into new territory. The third category is about mitigating, and in here we're looking a lot more at mobility intelligence. So this is very often about movement of people, whether or not it's restricting people from moving, for example, out of quarantine, whether it's sort of playing with the idea of access, borders, not borders, boundaries, these kinds of things. A lot of technologies which keep people in place. On the large scale, there are many that you've probably heard of from around the world. This is China. In China, for example, health code, which is more of a kind of entry system, a sort of simplification of whether or not you have the right profile or enough points or scores. These are kind of technologies that we use for other things. They've been transferred now to COVID. And then this is one example, but there are many, many others. Of course, there are now increasingly also vaccine passports and some digital vaccine passports, but it's all about, can you come in or not? What's your status? And then looking more at sort of community level, we've seen a huge rise in the use and adaptation of drones. And some of these drones have been used for keeping people in place, for observing people's movement, and also for watching, but also acting on the question of who can and can't go into different areas. This is a drone company called DJI, which is a Chinese drone company, but that works all over the world. For example, here's a DJI drone being deployed in San Francisco to actually, in San Francisco area and Bay Area, to actually monitor homeless camps in the context of trying to control the pandemic. So lots of different ways in which these technologies, we don't really see that in the news. We might have seen them in the city and telling people to stay home, but there's lots and lots of different ways now that these kinds of technologies are being used to look at movement of people and to therefore act on and restrict or curtail movement of people. Here's another drone company doing something kind of similar, but with a different purpose. And looking at the question of who might be sick, so much more detailed, let's say. And Dragonfly is interesting because they're one of the companies that claim to be able to not only tell if people, for example, as you can see on the slide, what their breathing, heart rate, temperature, and action means, like if they're coughing or something, are doing, but also claims to be able to tell if somebody, for example, may have taken a drug like, ibuprofen or Advil or whatever the appropriate drug is in your context to suppress their fever. So not only looking at a crowd who has a fever, but perhaps who is suppressing their fever with medication, which is a whole other level than we have seen previously. And then, of course, the digital fence system in Taiwan, which I'm sure you all know, which is has been widely debated and discussed, which is a really interesting proposition about how to safely enable people to do things like travel or re-enter the country, how to make sure that you don't have to physically barricade them, but you can find other ways. And I know that this example has been looked at elsewhere in digital fencing now. I mean, this in Taiwan, for example, was more about quarantining people who may have become in contact with the virus. Obviously, people who were quarantined were asked and were sick went to hospital, but people who were not sick but were in quarantine they were using digital fences. And actually, these kinds of technologies now becoming more and more commonplace, not necessarily on a countrywide level elsewhere, but actually sometimes on a building level or on a home level, and raising some really interesting discussions, which, for example, been debated by the digital minister of Taiwan, Audrey Tang, and very happy to talk about some of those really interesting dilemmas that have come out of this. Going one level deeper, here's a connection with the natural wristband that you wear. This is the stay home safe technology. This is the way in which it was promoted initially, at least in Europe. And again, interesting pivot on an adaptation of technologies here, technologies that was originally designed for prison inmates or people who were perhaps under house arrest, being actually readapted for quarantine, which is a whole new challenge in terms of sort of ethical issues, but also how to make that work effectively. I should say that this is technologies being used in a lot of different contexts too, for example, also in Australia. So these are just examples from around the world. And then the last category and theme is what we're thinking about, how technology is being developed that attempts to modify behavior, and how behavioral intelligence is used in that context to try to encourage people, as you see here, like nudging, redirecting, redesigning, to help them manage, and to help companies manage, and to help facilities manage in a kind of post-pandemic context. So again, I have 3 examples, starting from the zoom down. This is a company called Honeywell. There are many others as well who are looking at the ways in which buildings can be kept safe. There are others that we explored if you want to have a look at the 100 pandemic technologies. Some of them look at building management, occupancy management, predictive cleaning, different ways in which technology can help facility managers, not necessarily control the people in the building, but actually to modify behavior in the building based on what's happening in the building. So essentially a smart building, but with a very specific set of issues in mind, which might include things like air quality, might include things like zoning or movement of people, using technology to be one step ahead of what the potential concerns are. This is a technology by Volan, which is a little bit more focused specifically on schools. And again, like imagining what that future might look like in schools if you took this technology and applied it, some of which has already been tested, by the way. This is an American company that is testing this in some schools already. So I'm just, again, going to let you watch for yourself the video. I think one of the reasons that this example is so important is because it's not clear. I think some people look at that and they think, that's great, my kids are in school and I would be super happy if it was that, if it was that under control and everybody knew everything. And then there are other parts of this video where people might respond and think, we don't want our schools to be like that, or even if there was never the money to roll something like this out, there's a precedent being set here about the expectation of what happens in the school. And it is a kind of, regardless of the technology, raises all kinds of questions about how children are treated in school. There are different scenes in that video that some people may respond to differently. But the point is, it's changing the normalization and expectation of what a school is, how it functions, what its responsibilities are in this kind of imagined future that allows us to go back to school in this case, but sometimes back to work or back to normal. Here's a completely different take, which is more about technologies which might remind you to do certain things. This is again going back to the individual level. In this case is a technology called ImTouch, which is here offering to remind you when you touch your face too much, and therefore you may transfer an infection. And it does this through giving you a little buzz. And interestingly enough, these are technologies which are kind of like in general designed for kind of obsessive compulsive behaviors, and are now sort of translated to things like pandemic. So one of the things we've looked at in this context is what we call the pandemic pivot. So ways in which technologies that were designed for one thing are kind of being pulled across towards the pandemic. But with this last category of modifying, it's really about how technology might track, monitor, and therefore nudge our behaviors or try to control spaces or help us, again, going right from the building facility management through to the school, through to the individual. How might we kind of control and suggest, nudge, or kind of redesign the way we work together? And some of the examples, if you take a look at the project, are more about things like how can we make sure we don't stand too close to people? How can we make sure we don't have too many people in a room? Even things like elevator numbers of people. So lots of very specific technologies about sort of returning to so-called normal life. So just to kind of bring everything together, some of the narratives you've seen probably coming out when I was talking there, some others I mentioned at the end there, for example, this pandemic pivot thought, which is in what ways does crisis lead to, I'm not going to say innovation, because sometimes it's just investment, it's just transfer of existing technologies to new problems. So kind of like technologies as solutions, looking for problems. And then the second thing we looked at was what we think of as the behavioral and biometric intelligence industry. So which ways from the macro and micro individual to the macro level, so this even planetary level, made up of millions or billions of individuals, is behavioral and biometric data being collected and processed and analyzed and used for insights or for even predicting, or sorry, should I say, even laying down the path for action and response by especially by governments. So sometimes if you go through our scale, you know, sometimes for decision making in companies, sometimes for decision making even in the family, which ways is that but also becoming seen as more and more useful, and what new challenges does that raise for us? And then lastly, this question around this private and public relationship. So what are the lines between private interest and public good? And I know that this is sort of hotly debated and is quite different in different cultures as well, different political and social environments too, on like where does the private interest end? What is the limitations of kind of individualistic ways of seeing things? And where are we looking at a public good? And I think it's interesting looking at all the examples, thinking about all the examples we just went through, like which ones of these raise what kinds of questions for you? I think they're completely different. No one technology here is the same as another in terms of the questions it raises. So yeah, coming back to that question we started with, and this is where I guess I will end, is how do we answer this question? Are we succeeding in controlling the virus or just the host? So I think on that note, I'll leave it there. This is a final sort of lasting image from Dragonfly, one of the companies we looked at, showing a woman outside being recorded coughing. So maybe that's a good start for our discussion, a good place to end. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
好的，那我们现在就是进入我们的讨论 Q&A 时间。那大家可以，如果愿意的话，可以开启你的那个麦克风跟那个镜头。等一下哦。好，那刚刚就是Stephanie 就是已经提出了其实算4个问题啦。那第一个是就是比较大的，也是我们在那个就是介绍里面有讲到说，觉得这些科技呢，它是主要是在控制疫情吗？还是说应该是说大家的就是出发点都是要控制疫情，但它会不会最后其实就是比较是限制了人类就宿主我们自己？这个是大家可以想一下的。那另外刚刚也有讲到最后那3个问题，就第一个是说这个疫情的这个转折点，就有一些物品或者是设计，它本来不是用来做防疫的功能，但是它做到了变成了是用来用在这个防疫这个上面，那它之后会让我们的生活带来什么样的一个改变？那第二个问题是说，就是在这种biometric 就生物科技的这方面，那我们现在可能很多时候都要被，例如说常常要去检验啦、采检啦，或者是量体温也是一种人体的一个反应嘛。那这样的东西是被记录下来，会不会有什么样的一个问题？然后最后就是一个个人跟公领域之间的利益的这个问题。那大家的看法是怎么样？那我还是先请那个翻译的老师先稍微跟 Stephanie 讲一下我刚刚又重复了一下什么，然后大家可以想一下，有没有想要就是大家一起提出来讨论的？ 那我先请那个对嘉伟。
So previously, PE just gave us an overview and listed the 4 questions that you just mentioned about. First, about whether the tech controlling the virus or the host, or the second is about pivoting, whether we are using technologies for other purposes during the pandemic. And third is about metrics. When we are recording and documenting those metric features, are there going to be any privacy issues? What other issues that may occur? The last thing is about the private and public relationship. How are you going to do and deal with the boundary between private and public?
那有没有人就是想要当第一个发言者呢？
So now we can open the floor for questions, comments, or feedbacks. Of course, they can go through in by turning on their mic or writing in the comments.
有了。
Okay, we have someone raising his hand already.
Kiwi， 你可以对，你可以直接讲了。还是刚刚是不小心举到手。好，要不然我先分享我自己的想法好了。就关于，因为我觉得关于这个个人的利益跟私人利益跟大众利益这件事情，我觉得大部分在台湾的人应该是蛮习惯，也不是蛮习惯啦，就是都会以大众利益比较为前提啦，然后私人利益如果不是真的太难忍受，应该基本上都是会接受的。那就例如说像我们从5月开始就是进入了3级警戒之后，那政府其实也没有强制规定说大家一定要不能就是就是一定要居家工作，或者是说不能出去，或者是不能坐大众捷运。这些都没有规定，但是其实一开始3级了之后，大部分其实都是蛮自律的，待在家里，然后那个人潮是真的减少非常非常多这样子。那这是分享一下，就是大概是台湾的经验这样子。那好，我们先请翻译老师可以先翻译一下。
So Ping talks about the situation in Taiwan since mid-May. We have the level 3 warnings, and although it's not a strict lockdown, the government encouraged people to work from home or go out less frequently. And I think that in Taiwan, people are more used to prioritizing public goods over personal interests, if that's still acceptable in many cases. So we do see that people, the traffic outside is significantly lower, and also we are seeing many people choose to work from home, or many companies enforce work from home policy in that process. So that's the situation in Asia. I think we see a few hands already.
好，那我先请季汉，你可以开始喽。
嗨，我想问的是，可能我们疫情一开始的时候，就会看到国外很多新闻，大家跑出去，就是好像还是以自己的利益为优先啦。然后我想要问，就是像刚刚有提到 Volan 这个是监控，是算是保障一些学生他们在学校的一些安全。只是像刚刚 Stephanie 也有提到，就是这是有一些隐私的问题嘛。那我想问的是 Tactical Tech 他们在面对这些一些疑虑的时候是怎么说服大众的？
Okay, so we are seeing that during the pandemic, some countries and some Western countries, people still prioritizing their personal interests. So they still insist in going out, and they are not caring too much about the pandemic measures or restrictions. And that's maybe some cases in different parts of the world. And we also see in the presentation about Volan, that's a case that you have a lot of these monitoring facilities in schools, and you say that there was it's very controversial, and there are a lot of privacy concerns in the process. I wonder that, and from technical tech perspective, how do you convince people or communicate people regarding to this?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In Europe, it's interesting because you're right that there is a different attitude to public good and private interests. But a big difference that usually is overlooked is it's very divided. for example, half, I don't know the numbers, but let's say half of people are really concerned about public interest and really want to do things the right way and are staying home and don't go to work and all these other things. And half the people not only don't care or whatever, but see it as their right that they should do things the way they personally, individually want. Maybe you want to translate, maybe in short pieces.
那的确，在您刚才说的情况一样，在欧洲的社会情况是比较两极的。有些人大概一半的人会可能非常的遵守这些防疫规定，都待在家里或者居家工作等等。但是也有一半的人，他们是觉得自己的个人的利益比较重要，所以在欧洲的社会里面，这样的态度比较两极。
And I think there is like a meta-narrative about democracy and the restriction of power of the state to make sure that the state doesn't have too much power. But there's also the way people feel individually. And these two things are sometimes different. And I think some people in Europe are very careful and others, really don't have a sense of collective action. And I think it looks from the outside that nobody cares. And I think this is not true. I think it's more complicated than that. But I do think it's a huge divide. And it now becomes very political because people who are very much taking care of things are increasingly divided from people who don't. And this is creating a tension in society.
在这样的情况之下，其实会去抗拒这些政府约束的行为，其实有不同的层面。有些人是非常强调自己的个人主义，那有些人是以民主的角度认为必须要去管束或约束政府的权利等等。所以其实每个人的态度都有一些都有一些不同，所以它其实非常细微的差异。所以现在从外面看起来，也许觉得很多人大部分都好像不在乎这些的管束行为，但其实还有这个社会上现在是非常两极的情况，而且在疫情长期的发展之下，这两极变得越来越彼此的抗争或彼此的矛盾，他们之间彼此的冲突跟张力越来越明显。
One of the interesting things about that is it's not just generational. I think you would think, oh, young people don't care and older people are scared, but actually it is a political line. And there are many young people who are very careful. There are also many older people who are really falling into these conspiracy theories. And so it's not even a generational divide, it's more of a political divide.
现在看到的其实并不只是世代差异，有些也许觉得年纪比较大的人会通常比较愿意去遵守这些防疫规定，年轻人比较不愿意。但其实现在这个议题变得非常的具有政治性，所以有可能是这些政治性的因素导致于这些社会的态度变得非常的激化。
And then in your second question about this example I showed from the schools, I think in Tactical Tech, we don't think there's any right or wrong answer. And what we're really interested in doing is creating discussion and debate. Shall I pause more? Is it okay for you? Shall I stop now?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. We think it's complicated. And we think it's complicated not just because of the obvious thing, like there's no privacy in schools and that children grow up in this environment where everything is observed, everything is recorded, everything is documented. Yes, that's a problem, but also it's more of a problem for us. And I think it's more of an interesting debate when you start to think, how did that work before? You saw this in the video. There's an accident in the gym when they're playing, I think, volleyball or something, and the kid falls down the floor. You don't need a 3D model to know what happened there. You need a sports teacher. And why do we have to replace these basic things with technology? And this is more the interesting debate, I think. Yes, it's important to ask the question, was everything watched by a camera? Was everything recorded by a camera? And what does that mean for children's freedom when they're growing up? But also, why are we taking away this responsibility in the school from the way things normally work?
其实我们在 Tactical Tech 的态度当中，并不会去立刻去判断或评断它的对错。那我们主要是希望能够让大家有更多讨论的空间跟机会。刚才在 Volan 这个案例当中，当然这非常值得讨论，因为它其实是一个非常复杂的情况。一方面是各位看到在影片里面的案例是有个孩子在运动场的时候，可能打球的时候跌倒等等，然后这个时候当他们的影像的时候被这些的摄影机拍下来、记录下来之后，到底有什么样的影响？那孩子在这样的环境里面成长之后，会对他们的 人格发展跟生活发展有什么样的影响跟冲击。但是以刚才这个打排球跌倒例子而言来看好了，其实我们传统上而言就是直接通知老师，然后赶快送去医务室等等，这样的行为我们一向都可以在用人力的方式完成的时候，为什么需要用科技来取代它呢？这就是另外一个非值得讨论的问题。
好，谢谢。
Thank you。
好，那我们接下来请那个 Esther。Esther， 该你了。
没有主持人把视讯关，没关系。谢谢 Stephanie 的分享。那我想我的问题比较想要回应刚刚第3个部分，就是个人的利益跟公众利益在这个疫情之间的取舍。那我的看法是，恐惧这件事情恐怕是这次疫情或战争威胁下的主要的心理要素。那即使是非常多的人们都知道这个数位科技跟威权的控制，但是人们还是愿意放弃或者是松解这个个人的隐私、人权等等这些权利。那主要的问题还是来自于这个恐惧没有办法被解决。那 Stephanie 刚刚有分享的关于这个 Classroom 的一些推广，对观众或是大众理解这个数位的资讯的控制等等，但呢恐怕是在一个理性的理解来看这些事情。所以我比较关心的是说，在Tactical Tech 他们一向的这个处理这样子的推广的时候呢，怎么样可以做到解除恐惧这个营造，或破除现在这种不管是被营造出来的恐惧，还是人们自己灌输自己，有没有比较具体的方法可以破除或改变这些事情？谢谢。
Thank you for the presentations. I think I would like to talk about the struggles between private and public. And I think that during the pandemic, the reason why a lot of people are willing to follow the digital technologies or follow the government rules is because of the fear. And the fear is a mental factor that puts people to accept a lot of things they normally would not accept. So I think that's the issues we have to deal with. And normally we see that in Tactical Tech, you have this classroom, there's huge campaigns around the world that try to communicate and discuss with people. And I think that normally we can discuss in a very rational way. But I wonder that under the pandemic, for example, how do Tactical Tech try to respond, address the fear, the emotional fear or the irrational fear? Or how do you talk about this kind of fabricated or even self-inflicted fear among people and try to resolve a lot of issues in their mind?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would absolutely agree that the pandemic is a new test for acceptance. And I would also say that what's been very interesting is watching the debates around privacy flip during this time, where people's lines of what is okay and what is not okay move based on fear. And also some people that you would not expect to be committed to this problem have changed their position. Maybe I let you say that because it's complicated what I'm going to say, so I pause here. Yeah.
所以当然我也同意您的看法，尤其在这个疫情之下，大家很多的态度或者对于隐私权的接受程度开始出现犹疑或改变。很多人也许过去没办法接受的某些事情，在这疫情之下或恐惧之下，因此开始可以接受或者是被迫接受某些事情。
And here's a very complicated thing that we observed. And let's say certainly in Europe, I can speak from this perspective, but I would be interested how it works in other countries, maybe the US as well, that people who would normally be concerned about privacy during the pandemic were like, well, it's okay. In this context, we need to give our information, we need to be safe and so on. And on the other hand, people who might be more conservative normally, who would be, yeah, you know, I don't mind about my data because it helps me watch Netflix or, you know, get adverts, we're suddenly like, I'm leaving my mobile phone at home because people are tracking me. And so we had this flip on who's interested in the problem of privacy and why, because it became more attached to libertarian issues as opposed to public good issues. And so you had this I don't know if I explained it so well, but basically the people you would expect to behave one way behaved the other. And we had this flip in who cares about privacy during this time, which makes it an interesting moment to learn about what our values are and how they're connected politically. Maybe they're different than we thought initially.
在现在这个疫情的情况之下，我们看到很多人的态度，也许跟我们预期之间有些很大的差别。比如说，一般而言比较会在乎这个疫情的或者隐私的这些人，他们可能在疫情之下反而觉得我们愿意会去提供这些私人的资料或者私人资讯，为了能够去保障这些大众的安全。反而是那些过去不太在乎这些个人资料分享给外面，比如说为了可以看 Netflix， 他完全不在乎能够把那个个人资料提供给大企业，这些人反而现在会特意的把手机留在家里，因为他们觉得自己受到监控，所以这是一个我们看到因为疫情而产生的反动，或者是一个反应的不同。所以反而我们认为在乎隐私权的人反而比较愿意分享。那也许这个就并不只是一个个人因素的关系，它可能也涉及很多政治立场的变化，也可能跟自由主义等等有关系。
I think just to say one more thing, I think it's I think the questions, we're still very focused on the questions of privacy, and they're no longer the right questions, is my view. We need other language and other frames of reference, because we should be much more concerned, less about privacy, more about, like, for example, what is it that the algorithms do? What is it that it means to have your behavior nudged? Like, this is not about privacy, it's about ethics in technology and how it interacts with humans. And this is a very different set of questions that we don't really even have language for. And we also see that it's more about power. Like it can be, and trust and transparency and, you know, legal frameworks, because it can be okay to have all your information collected to keep everyone safe if it's really well regulated, or if it's deleted, or if it's in the right person's hands. What does it mean when we have, and this is many of the examples I showed, these very, very big companies or these intelligence agencies handling the data compared to, I don't know, a trusted publicly owned source, right? Ownership becomes so much more important now than maybe privacy even.
我们现在还在讨论的重点还是在隐私上面，但其实我觉得我们可能要用另外一套语言、另外一种架构来思考这个问题。那其实会涉及到的是，到底我们就如何去面对科技去影响人们的行为，或者是科技如何去管控或者是掌握我们的资料等等。例如说，其实这其中涉及了权利、涉及了信任，还有法律架构等等。比如说，我们在把这些资料交出去之后，它到底落到了谁的手中？是落到这些大的科技公司的手中？那这些大的科技公司手中，他们在管理这些资料的时候，他们的模式跟我们如果交给了政府，那他们政府的处理方式会不会跟科技公司有些不同，或者是政府有没有办法跟大家保证说这些的资料在一定的时间之后会删除，或者是他们会受到好的保护等等，这些我觉得是我们应该需要新的语言或不同的方式来思考这个问题，而不只是在讨论隐私部分。
And just to say, I mean, on the negative side, the crisis and the fear, and this is back to the question, makes a lot of allowances. Because of this, a lot of new technologies are introduced, or a lot of technologies are allowed that were not allowed before, or because of the fear, new investment is made into things that would not normally get investment because they may be too ethically complicated. So that's kind of the downside, that we have this like umbrella or shield that we accept a lot that we would not normally accept. And yeah, maybe I'll let you say this and I just say what the upside is maybe.
所以当然在这样的疫情跟恐惧之下，在危机之下，大家的会出现一些负面效应，比如说大家的接受度变宽了，他们愿意接受这些科技所掌控的范围变宽了，所以等于说大家的开始变得投资有些不同，或者是新的科技开始引进了，是因为大家开始愿意接受在疫情之下有这样的变化，所以这个是疫情之下出现在科技方面还有道德方面的一些负面的影响。
Yeah, and it's an interesting time because then you see what is being normalized, what will be normalized in the future as well. It's always a steady increase. You know, it looks like a small thing now or is a temporary thing, but then it becomes normal and so on. And then on the upside, you have more and more technology developers who, well, it's still a small number, but there are some technology developers who see the problem and want to find solutions that reduces these concerns. So for example, one company we looked at is looking at capacity in the stadium, like a football stadium or like a concert hall. And they develop a system precisely that only observes and deletes at the same time. So it makes a record of, for example, how many people are wearing a mask. And as soon as that information is processed, at the same time it's deleted. And all you're left with is not the information, but the analysis, because the analysis is all you need, actually, from the government point of view or the person who owns the stadium. You don't really need the information on everybody in the stadium, and what they're doing and what they look like and how long they've been there or whatever. You just need to know 80% of people are wearing masks, or this kind of thing. So they design the technology differently now. So I guess my positive view on it is possible to design the technology so that these kind of concerns are reduced. It's just that it's very rare.
刚才提到是这些科技所造成或这些恐惧在造成的负面影响，这个一切变得越来越常态化。很多的事情从一小步的慢慢开始转变之后，久而久之，大家好像慢慢习惯这些科技一直在掌控我们和监控我们，这是一个负面的影响的情况。但是也的确会有一些新的比较正面的发展。当然，有些比较少数的科技的研发的人员，他们也了解到这些大数据或者这些演算式他们对我们的影响之后，他们发展出了一套新的科技。例如说，我们刚才在观察的一家公司，他们会开发出一套的监测系统，它监测的是不论是运动场或者是演唱会、音乐厅等等的这个容纳量。那它在观察的同时进行分析，但分析的结束的时候，他们最后只留下分析的结果，而不会留下任何数据。他们同时在删除这些数据，因为毕竟到最后大家只需要这个分析的结果，他只要知道，比如说80%人都戴了口罩，或者是他们在这个过程当中有多少人进入了这个空间，他们并不需要去留下各种个人的记录，比如说这个人在这边待了多久，或者是这个人在里面做了什么事情。所以这也是现在有些科技的研发人员，他们开始意识到这样的科技发展下去之后可能产生的潜在威胁，所以做出了一些改变。
好，那我刚刚有看到，就是有脸书的观众，就是针对我们刚刚讲的这个提出了一个比较雷同相近的一个提问哦，所以我就可能先讲他的那个部分。那他是说有许多的科技，大部分都是由私人企业私人企业去支持的，或者是也许有政府支持，他不确定。那这些收集来的资料库的运用范畴还有管控，是否因此应该要衍生说相关的法规或者是的订立或者是一个改变哦？像是台湾之前就是有引发一个蛮有争议的事件，就例如说我们现在还在作为疫调功能的这个实联制，就是被警方所使用的这样的一个问题。那我想他应该是想要知道说，这样是不是之后会促成一些立法上面的法规的改变，这样子，想要知道 Stephanie 的意见。
We know that a lot of technologies are invented and deployed and supported by private companies, and probably some technology are also supported by governments. And so a lot of people are concerned about when you are collecting those data, the ownership of those data, how those data can be used, and maybe we need to adjust or amend the regulations and law in the futures in response to these new developments. We have a recent case in Taiwan that we are giving away a lot of our location informations, but later on these local informations are used by law enforcement, which is not envisioned to be used originally. So I wonder that you see in European countries or other countries that people are starting to think about whether the law and regulations have to be amended, or are there any examples that amendments have happened?
Yeah, I should just say before I answer that, I don't know if you can hear this very atmospheric piano, but there's somebody practicing piano outside. So if it's coming, hopefully it's a nice disruption, but it's quite loud here. I think the interesting thing we saw with the pandemic was, I think those of us who study and research these questions of privacy and data collection and private companies, they can, like those of us who study know it's there. We know the location data is being collected, for example, and we know what that says. So I just make a quick example. When we did research with data brokers a few years ago now, like 4 or 5 years ago, they said that the number one piece of information is location data, because from this you can tell everything. You can tell what somebody's habits are, you can tell what somebody's behaviors are, you can tell who they know, you can tell what they're interested in, you can tell what their patterns are, what time of, just think about it. Even, do you normally go to bed and come home at 11 o'clock at night, but then every Friday you go out till 3? Everything you can, and then you're always out till 3 with friends, eating pizza, whatever. They know everything, and you don't need any other piece of information really than location data. So I think we say something like location data, sounds simple, but then the more you think about what you can tell from these patterns, you can tell everything about someone's life. And increasingly, like living in the city, you might not know who lives in your building and what they do, what their life patterns are. But actually somebody who's tracking location data of everyone in this building can see all those patterns together and how they interlink. So even when you're not just the individual, but the layers, and then you realize that you really don't need any other information to know what everyone is doing. So this small piece of information sounds simple, but it's really complicated. And I'm just mentioning this because I saw the question there in the chat also about the value of data. And so step one is like understanding the real value of the analysis of the data, not the data itself. The data is just numbers, letters, whatever. But what does it mean?
在这边看到的确有很多这些的资讯存在，那很多的这些资料的用法，还有这些资料到底能告诉我们事情，其实非常的也许一开始听起来不是非常的显而易见。我们前几年在去研究这个资料前课的时候，他们就告诉我们，其实大家很多的人在追踪这些资料或运用资料是最在乎的，或是最好用的，就是这些我们所在地点的资料。因为光是知道你的所在地点，其实就可以知道你的个人习惯、你的兴趣、你的这些生活的模式等等。比如说你平常可能都11点之前就到家，到礼拜五晚上的时候可能到凌晨3点才到家，这些的资料其实都可以告诉我们一个人的生活习惯、他的范围、他的人脉，还有他的这个兴趣网络等等。比如说我们可能跟自己同住一栋大楼的邻居彼此之间不认识，可是如果去追踪这些资料的话，他其实可以看到很多这些人的交集，很多人不同之间的生活习惯跟往来等等。所以对我来说，我们刚才看到聊天室里面有另外一个问题，聊到资料的价值，资料其实本身只是数字而已，但是重点是进行了分析之後得到什麼樣的結果。
And what we saw for the first time with the pandemic, and in a very transparent way, was why that data is valuable connected to something like public health for the first time. We knew it could be, but it never really happened before. But we also saw how all these private companies and all the public data was merged. So you had this, I'm thinking, for example, in South Korea, you had the first time the level of data across public and private merged that had normally only been possible for law enforcement before. So you would have like travel data, which is public data, private company data. So travel data, which is private. You'd have credit card data, which is private. You'd have mobile phone data, which is private. And then you'd have that mixed with health records, for example, which is public, or maybe your ID, which is public. And so all this data overnight became one big pool to be used for like a new form of investigation, but health investigation, not a criminal investigation, for example.
在疫情之下，我们看到很多私人企业跟公共卫生资讯开始有混合或开始整合的情况。我们以前都认为这些的资料也许有机会可以用在公卫的议题上面，但是以前只是想象或者只是推测。但这次看疫情关系，看到非常明显的案例，比如说在韩国就看到非常明显，私人公司跟公卫之间的资料开始连接在一起，开始有更多串接的可能性。比如说个人，我们一般私人这些的通勤资料，一般个人的信用卡资料，个人的这些手机的发话简讯等等这些资料，这些都是私人资料。但是现在开始，因为比如说为了疫调的关系，它可能开始跟身份证资料混在一起，或者是跟一些很多的公共卫生的这些资料联合在一起之后，产生了一些新的现象。但理论上这些的都应该在疫情里面作为疫调之用，而不是刑事调查之用。
So all that story to say, yes, we saw for the first time an unprecedented level of private and public data mixed without permission and without, and governments often giving new rights to the health authorities, for example, which were normally maybe only for law enforcement before. And I think for this, it was so fast, and not only that, but the need is so high that it will take a long time for governance to come into place that will balance it. And you do see some cases now coming, like even in Israel, happened one case, for example, that the government was using the intelligence agencies for monitoring the whole population, and the Court of Justice actually removed this right or restricted it. It also happened in France, for example, and other places with the use of drones in the UK as well, that there was a quick response, but it's been difficult because the justification for using the data is very high. I think
yeah, it's good. Yeah, you can finish.
The last thing I was going to say is, I think what needs to happen next is really, well, my personal view, I don't work on policy for a reason. Like, I think it takes a long time for policy to come into place. And I think it's a really tough battle, and I think it's necessary, but I'm not having the patience to work through this policy route because I think it takes a long time. I think what would be very important is to show that it's possible to do it differently. The sweet spot, I think, is that we need to find is how can we make these things, but make them in a way that by design makes them more ethical, rather than waiting for regulation to tell the government what they can and can't do, and to hope that it works. I think we also need solutions that show that it's possible to do it ethically.
在现在疫情之下，因为一切变化发生的太快，所以很多的时候政府都依据在这样的紧急情况之下，开放了很多权利给过去并没有这些权利的单位。比如说过去这些资料并不是开放给卫生单位使用的，但是这些原本是属于行政单位或者是其他行政部门的资料，现在就开放给卫生单位使用了。所以大家对这些需求也很高，所以可以普遍而言都愿意去接受这样的变化。但其实也有一些不同的案例，比如说以色列而言，他们之前曾经用情报单位的力量去掌控全国的人民，当然很快就受到了很多人的批评，还有很多人的反对。那另外在英国跟法国，他们之前曾经使用无人机来作为疫调或者去作为监控，很快也有受到很多人的反对。所以在某些情况之下，大家的反应会特别激烈，会特别快速。但是在其他的政策或法规上面的话，我通常认为这样的时间需要很久，所以我通常并不会太自己没有太多的兴趣想要去涉入在法规或者政策上面，因为当然它很重要，可是要仰赖法规或政策来改变事情的速度实在太慢了。所以我通常是希望能够让大家看到这些科技有什么样的可能性，那如何能够从一开始研发或设计的时候就让它能够符合道德的规范或原则，让他们在运用跟实行的时候不会在一开始造成了损害之后才用法规或政策的方式来亡羊补牢。
Can I pick on another question here I see in the chat, if it's okay, about the question here about the protests in France concerning the vaccine certificate, and the question is about the balance of liberty and public health.
Yeah, sure.
So I just want to mention that I think this is one of the biggest questions we will face soon. Not just because of pandemic, but because of things like climate change as well. We will have to, as we increasingly face this kind of existential crisis, and it's not just national, these are global crises, which is, we didn't really have this in our lifetimes, most of us had it only maybe last time Second World War or something, that were connected by this crisis at this level. And I think that and most of us don't remember that, or were not alive then. And so I think as we now face this pandemic and also the increasing risks are related with climate change, we will have to balance this liberty and public good question differently. And technology is not the reason, nor will it be the solution, but it's a facilitator in that context of this kind of fight against these bigger challenges. And I think this dilemma of liberty and public good, and on the other hand, these trade-offs between private interests and public need, and the question of like ownership and how technology will control us or control the problem, will become some of our biggest dilemmas, in my opinion, over the next, for example, decade. maybe longer. Let's see.
在刚才聊天室里面有另外一个问题提到的是，在现在法国有一些针对了疫苗护照的这些抗争，还有很多认为他们会干涉到人的自由等等。那 Stephanie 认为其实并不只是这个疫情的关系，还有很多的全球议题，例如说气候变迁等等，这些都是威胁到人们生存的这些重要议题。那过去也许世界各国并没有这个会让所有人都共感或同感的这些全球议题，现在在我们的这个生活当中，其实越来越多这样的问题，那也势必会牵扯到更多未来大家必须要做各种的取舍跟这个各种不同的挣扎，例如说科技到底要用到什么样的程度，那这个资料所有权等这些的问题，在未来还有这个自由跟公共利益之间的这个纠结跟纠葛，未来也会在未来10年或者更长会变得越来越严重，会变得越来越迫切。
And just to say the last thing on that is that we become more and more nationalistic in our responses, right? We're different how we respond. We need to close the borders. We have to stay home. We have to not travel, and so on. And on the other hand, these crises, they don't respect borders. Like there is no line between one country and the other, even when you're an island, as we've seen with the pandemic. The same goes for climate change. These large global problems, they don't care about boundaries and borders and national restrictions, right? And so we will all need each other, and we will have to collaborate, and technology is going to be the way that happens, and data is going to be the thing that makes that work. And this is going to be a huge dilemma. It can't be dealt with only nation by nation.
在现在疫情之下，很多时候国家是用这种民族主义的方式来解决问题，他们可能关闭边界，认为大家应该待在家里面，不要出去旅行，然后让自己能够把自己这个国家封锁起来之后，好像就可以解决问题。但是很显然看到，不论是疫情或者全球气候变迁等等，这些的问题是不分国界的，它并没有国界的限制。就在我们这样住在台湾这个岛上，还是会受到疫情的影响跟气候变迁的影响。所以如果要去促成这些彼此之间的合作跟彼此之间的需求的这些连结的话，势必要运用这些科技，还有很多的资料。可是当然也提到了科技跟资料就会牵扯到人们的自由，还有人们的这个私人利益跟私人的这些的公司之间的分别。所以的确这个问题在这些跨国的议题当中变得越来越迫切。
好，那另外就还有一个也是关于疫苗护照的问题哦。他说这样的概念是也是控制了宿主而非病毒的这样的管理方式。但是就是这个听位他想问的说，他觉得是不是最终也只能透过来控制宿主的方式来去控制病毒呢？
So definitely in the presentation you mentioned about whether we're controlling the virus or controlling the host. And I think one of the participants in the chat rooms also says that he thinks that the vaccination's passport in some ways are one of the ways to control the host instead of the virus. But do you think that in the end we can only controlling the virus by controlling the host?
Well, we will see. I don't think anybody knows the answer to this question. I think the point of this question is to say how many of these things are, we're really interested in the imagination in this context. So we want to think that we're so clever with our technology, and that even this tiny thing we can't see, that we can control it. And the truth is we can't. We've seen that even when we have an island and we have quarantine hotels and we have 100% observance and so on, it still comes in somehow. So regardless of how clever we are, we cannot fight this thing we cannot see that's minuscule, and we don't really fully understand. And the idea that, for example, in a crowd, something which looks at everyone's temperature will work is a fantasy. And we know that because we know lots of people who have it don't have a temperature, like even this basic fact, right? Basic thing. You get very complicated technologies like the example I gave that can tell if you're taking medication to suppress your fever. This is a very complex question, but who cares? Because you might not even have a fever and you might have it. So this is a fantasy in our view, that you can control it. And instead the proxy is this very sophisticated, and even this word smart used everywhere, projection of what we want to do, but it actually doesn't work in most cases. But we put a lot of money and a lot of effort into this, and I think that it makes us feel better, like we're doing something in the positive way. You can take it a negative way, right? You can say, oh, but it's just another system of control and it's an excuse. You can also take it a positive way, which is why we use this technologies of hope, because they're always intended well, but maybe they're very, very naive, is our feeling. And I guess I say one more thing, which is it's very important, I think, as well, to understand where this is a distraction from the real problem and when it's a diversion from the real problem. And for politicians and for people who have to do something, it's great to be able to say, oh, but we put the system in place, we're busy with this, we invested, you know, $500 million in making sure that you're all safe. And I think sometimes it's a distraction from the real problem or from the real solution. They need, like, train more nurses or educate people better, or, you know, whatever it is, which is inconvenient. Those other solutions are big, difficult to implement, time consuming, not easy. Whereas coming along with a new app is, you know, overnight, I fixed your problem. It's a fantasy in our view.
在现在到底能不能透过控制宿主来控制病毒，这个也是很多人都想要得到的答案，我们现在还没有答案。不过我们必须在这个时候要去想象一下，要运用大家的想象力，因为很多时候我们都觉得好像用科技可以解决很多问题，甚至去管控跟约束这些我们看不见的病毒，但事实上显然我们并不完全了解这个病毒，然后目前看起来科技又完全透过科技来控制病毒也是一个不可行的情况。因为比如说大家也许想象的是到一个空间，到了公共环境的时候，可以透过监测体温的方式来判断大家是不是有染疫等等，但是其实我们都知道这次的疫情当中很多人是无症状感染者，所以这种情况之下，就算是他没有发烧，可能还是可能是带原者，或者是我们刚才看到另外一个公司，他试图去透过他可能甚至可以用科技的方式来判断这个人是不是吃了某些药物之后来抑制他的发烧情况，可是还是一样没有办法解决问题，因为如果是无症状感染者的话，他并不会发烧，所以光是想象或者是期望科技可以解决这些问题的话，其实是非常天马行空跟不切实际的。那当然我们也可以说，有些人他运用这些科技的时候是利益良善，但是非常天真的认为好像用科技可以解决的问题，但实际上情况可能远比这些科技研发单位而想得更加复杂。而且很多时候我觉得透过这些科技的时候，大家其实是用一种投机取巧或者是方便的方式来让大家忽略了这些真正的问题。比如说政治人物会跟大家说，我们花了很多的钱很多时间去开发了一个新的科技来保护大家等等，但是可能就反而忽略了这些更根本的问题，例如说在公共卫生教育方面的缺失，或者是当初在医生护理人员训练上面人数不够的问题，这些都是最根本的问题。可是这些问题要解决势必比较困难，而且比较耗时，所以政治人物或者这些政府单位反而会用科技的方式让大家有一种莫名的心安的感觉。
And I guess the last thing is we also seeing these technologies not work. I mean, not only would I say that we now know that you don't have a fever necessarily when you're still contagious, in fact, you may be asymptomatic, but also the flip side, like they're finding now that some people, women who are pregnant, have a slightly higher temperature, or some of these entry systems into buildings where you have a thermal camera checking your temperature before you go in, and when it's very hot, which of course is everywhere right now in the world where there's summer because of climate change, and they can't differentiate between your temperature and the high temperature outside when it's very, very hot, which is the case right now in many countries. So never mind whether or not you can tell people in a crowd with a fever, whether that's relevant data or not, which I would argue it's not. But even then, they don't really work half the time. They don't take into account real world circumstances. So these things we always say they're made for the ideal world, not the real world. And I think this is how a lot of technology is.
在很多科技都其实它设想的是在理想的情况之下可以发挥效用，但是很多时候实际这样的情况却未必是如此。比如说刚才有提到这个用科技的方式来感测大家的体温的情况，那当然有时候如果是孕妇的话，体温就稍微比较高，所以它的一般的感测的这些数据或者标准可能就不完全适用，或者是现在在气候变迁的情况之下，很多的环境很多的地区都本来气温就很高，所以这种情况之下，我们透过热感测仪的时候，到底有没有办法判断出这些人是体温本来就比较高，或者是因为染疫而变得比较高，所以这些是一个所以对我来说，如果我自己来判断的话，我觉得这个温度的体温的这个资料其实是 对于这个疫情而言是不相关或是没有任何特别意义的，可是很多时候大家还是会希望能够透过体温的辨别来判断大家是不是有染疫。
好，那因为我们时间快要到了5点，我们时间今天是排定到5点半。那就是最后一个问题，那他提问到说，就是在这个监控的之下，那有可能可以去防范一些犯罪的行为，就是犯罪人数可能会就是变少了，但是好像会有个副作用，就是引发出更多的诈骗集团的。那我不知道就是 Stephanie 有没有就是听过这样的事情，或者是说针对这样的话，他Stephanie 看法是怎么样子？
So I think we have time for the last questions. And in this chat room, one of the participants asked that under the surveillance systems, I think that we may see fewer crimes because that everything is monitored and everything is under surveillance. However, we are also seeing that these data are being misused for scams, or that people are scammed because of their fears, or because the data have been misused. So I don't know how to think about these issues and how to think that people should respond to it.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say, and I think the answer is in the question, that crime, in my view, never really completely disappears from society, it just moves. And so you see more sophisticated ways of enacting this crime, or it's more hidden. You drive it underground more than on the street, for example. Maybe it's safer to walk home at night, but maybe it's less safe to buy something online, or other ways that people are corrupted into or tricked into doing things. So I guess we've seen in many other instances that there's a direct connection as well between increase in surveillance in public spaces and in communities, and unfortunately systemic racism or violence, or like different ways in which these kinds of prejudices are institutionalized. So I guess I'm trying to say that we don't have any examples currently where there's an increase in surveillance in cities, for example, that hasn't led to an increase in discrimination against certain communities. Maybe it exists somewhere in the world, but not that I've seen. And I hope that it exists. But what we've seen in general is that surveillance is increased on, and those prejudices and those assumptions are increased on certain communities. And usually that's migrant communities, or communities of color, or low-income communities. For example, in many places in the pandemic, there's been an increase in surveillance of migrant workers, and because the assumption is they're living in poor conditions, and then they are disproportionately surveilled to people living in affluent areas who maybe, according to the authorities, not only have less crime, but also maybe follow the rules more. And then you end up with these massive inequities. So it could be that there are places where this is not happening, but mostly we see the opposite evidence.
其实在这些的环境当中，犯罪永远不会消失，它只是不断转变形态而已。所以可以看到，在监控的情况下，有些犯罪也许减少了，但是它其实其他的犯罪就因此增加了。例如说，刚才变得越长越习惯去网络上消费的时候，你的信用卡资料被盗窃的情况可能就更加普遍、更加频繁、更容易发生等等。而且其实这些的监控并没有办法去解决很多我们在体制上面、系统上面去面对的这些种族主义啊，或者是暴力，或者各种偏见等等。例如说，我们现在看到，其实很多时候在监控的这些条件或监控的这些设定上面，反而会加剧了很多的歧视或很多偏见的发生。很多时候，这些监控越来越常发生在这些有色人种或者是低收入户家庭当中，或低收入户的社区里面，或者是有些很多国家里面，因为这些监控的增加之后，政府选择把监控放在很多的移工身上，因为移工也许居住的环境比较不良的情况，或者是卫生条件比较差的情况，政府认为他们更需要受到监控。也许政府就反而相对而言，他们会觉得某些比较富裕的地区、比较富庶的社区，他们相对这些民众的犯罪情况比较少，或他们认定这些人比较守法等等。那这些的偏见，目前为止我看到都随着监控增加而变得越来越剧烈。
And just to I guess simplify the answer a little bit, and the metaphor is we see technology as a mirror. So, and that means that when you put a technology in place, you're replicating the bias of society, you're replicating the politics of society or the social moment, the cultural differences. And this is what you see happen when the technology is implemented. And you can take examples not just all over the world, but throughout history as well. When you look at this question, it's just a fact that technology doesn't have any power in itself, but it reflects the society in which it's implemented. And if you have a perfect society with no injustice and complete equity, then maybe the technology is fantastic, but we don't have many societies like that in the world, if any. So I think we can always expect from technology, whatever it is, that it will mirror the problems that we have and just extend or amplify them.
其实我们常常说科技只是一个镜像，或它其实扩大了我们现在社会的现况。所以如果我们的社会里面有这些不同的歧视、偏见、不公不义或问题跟暴力的话，其实科技只会去反映出这样的问题，而且只会放大这些问题。所以当然如果科技运用在这些没有任何不公不义的理想社会这些的这个乌托邦的话，当然就不会有这些问题。可是显然现在社会里面还是有很多我们所面对的偏见、歧视以及各种的问题存在。所以透过科技我们看到的就是这些问题变得更大，变得放大了。
好，谢谢。那就是我们今天的，因为我们的提问或者我们讨论大部分都是针对在这个数位反思、科技反思这个面向，所以如果有就是朋友就是提了比较远一点的问题，那不好意思，我们今天可能没有办法就是有时间来做这个问答哦。那所以今天到了这个讲座最后面，就是稍微做一个结论，就也是说这个现在这个科技的议题啦，跟疫情啦这两者之间的这样的一个问题，我想未来10年或者更久，就是我们几乎这一代人都是必须要去面对，然后那就是要一直去关注这样的议题。所以就是希望，也不是希望，反正就结尾就是，大家共勉之，就是在这个问题上面，那我们就是希望，我不知道做什么结尾了，反正就是可以继续关注这个议题，这样子，谢谢大家。
So that the time is up today, and thank you everyone for your participations. I think that tech and pandemic, and especially tech under the pandemic, is something that we have to continue to pay more attention to and think about as we evolve and as we respond, adapt to the real situation and new situations. And that's something that probably is that we have to think in the next decades or even longer.
好，好，那谢谢大家，我们今天的讲座到此结束。谢谢。
So thank you. That concludes our session.
Thank you,
Bye.
Stephanie.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.